moving in with her daughter-in-law, and discovering a dark secret that changes her life.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Mom, you're here. Let me help you with the bags. Maria's voice was gentle but carried a hint of busyness. She quickly took the handbag from her mother-in-law's hand and led her into the house. The home was bright and tidy, but the peculiar silence within the space struck Ms. Teresa as odd. However, she brushed it off, thinking she simply needed time to adjust to this new environment. "Hi, Mom," James greeted absent-mindedly, his eyes glued to his phone screen. He lounged on the sofa, legs propped up on the table, with no intention of standing to welcome his mother. His indifference felt like a small stab to Ms. Teresa's heart. Still, she smiled and replied calmly. "James, I've been looking forward to being here with your family." Maria showed her mother-in-law to the room prepared for her. The space was meticulously cleaned, with sheer white curtains fluttering in the breeze. "Please take some rest, Mom. Let me know if you need anything," Maria said before quickly retreating to the kitchen. The sight of Maria busily juggling tasks, caring for the children and preparing dinner warmed Ms. Teresa's heart. She thought to herself, "What a considerate and devoted daughter-in-law she is. How fortunate I am." That evening, as the family gathered around the dining table, Ms. Teresa tried to initiate a conversation. She shared memories of her hometown and spoke of the orange grove she once tended. "I'm so happy to finally be close to my grandchildren," she said, her gaze soft as she looked at the two children playing nearby. James raised an eyebrow and cut her off curtly. "Mom, make yourself comfortable here, but stop talking so much about the countryside. It's boring." His words hit Ms. Teresa like a cold slap, but she maintained her composure. Maria shot James a reproachful look but chose to remain silent. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ms. Teresa lay awake. Muffled arguments from James and Maria's room seeped through the thin walls. She sat up, straining to hear. James's voice was sharp and cold. "Why are you still standing there? I told you to clean up this mess." Maria's voice, soft and restrained, replied. "I will. Please don't raise your voice, Mom might hear." Ms. Teresa's heart tightened. The seemingly serene household was clearly hiding secrets she didn't yet understand. The next morning, as Maria prepared breakfast in the kitchen, Ms. Teresa sat beside her and gently asked. "Maria, I heard arguing last night. Is everything okay, my dear?" Maria flinched slightly, then quickly waved it off. "It's nothing, Mom. Just a little disagreement. Please don't worry." Her evasive response only deepened Ms. Teresa's concern. She looked into Maria's eyes and saw the exhaustion hidden behind her forced smile. Later that afternoon, Ms. Teresa decided to observe the family more closely to understand their daily life. She noticed Maria working tirelessly, mopping floors, doing laundry, preparing meals, and picking up toys. Meanwhile, James remained glued to the sofa, his eyes fixed on his phone, occasionally chuckling at a funny video. Once, Maria hesitantly handed James an electricity bill and said softly, "We're short this month. Could you contribute a bit more?" James brushed her hand aside dismissively. "I don't have money. Figure it out yourself." From a distance, Ms. Teresa watched this exchange with a heavy heart. She felt something was amiss but refrained from intervening too soon. She thought perhaps time would mend things. Yet Maria's weary expression and resigned demeanor haunted her throughout the evening. That night, Ms. Teresa sat in her room, gazing out at the small yard. She reminisced about her younger days when she and her husband built a life together from scratch. Despite the hardships, they always cherished and supported one another. Thinking of her daughter-in-law toiling away while James remained indifferent, an indescribable sadness welled up within her. When Maria brought her a cup of tea that night, Ms. Teresa took her hand and said softly, "Maria, you work so hard. If you need help with anything, please don't hesitate to ask me." Maria gave a faint smile and replied. I'm fine, Mom. As long as you're healthy, I'm happy. But in Maria's eyes, Miss Teresa saw a deep, unspoken sorrow. That night, she resolved to observe more closely and uncover the truths hidden beneath the seemingly peaceful surface of the household. The following morning, Miss Teresa woke early. She went downstairs to find Maria bustling about in the kitchen. She wore an old apron, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. A faint hum came from the washing machine in the corner, full of children's clothes waiting to be done. Breakfast was almost ready, but James had yet to appear. Maria, don't you ever take a break? Miss Teresa asked with concern. Maria quickly turned around, forcing a smile. I'm used to it, Mom. Every morning is like this, getting the kids ready for school and making breakfast. And James? Miss Teresa frowned slightly. He's still sleeping. He'll be up soon, Maria replied hastily, a flicker of unease crossing her face. During breakfast, Miss Teresa tried to keep the atmosphere cheerful. James came down the stairs lazily, wearing a crumpled shirt and messy hair. He sat down and immediately grabbed his phone, scrolling without paying attention to anyone. The children, Laura and Peter, ate quietly, but the silence was almost suffocating. James, don't you think you should help Maria a little? Miss Teresa asked gently. Without looking up, James smirked dismissively. Mom, Maria's great. She can handle everything. I don't need to do anything. Maria quickly changed the subject, as if trying to avoid conflict. Kids, finish up. Mommy will take you to school. Miss Teresa could feel the tension between the couple. James showed no intention of supporting Maria and seemed utterly detached from everything around him. After breakfast, James left the table, leaving Maria to clean up the mess on her own. Miss Teresa remained seated, watching James's figure disappear into the living room, her heart weighed down with sorrow. That afternoon, when James went out, Miss Teresa decided to have another conversation with Maria. The two of them sat in the small kitchen, where sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the weariness etched on Maria's face. Maria, is there anything you want to share with me? I see how hard you're working, Miss Teresa said gently. Maria lowered her head, clutching a dish towel tightly in her hands. There's nothing, Mom. It's just family responsibilities. But I see you doing everything while James doesn't help at all. That's not normal responsibility, Maria. That's unfair, Miss Teresa said firmly. Maria looked up, her eyes red, but she forced a smile. I'm really fine, Mom. It's just that sometimes James can be a little difficult. Miss Teresa didn't press further, but in her heart, she knew Maria was hiding something. She resolved to observe more closely to uncover the truth. That evening, Miss Teresa noticed more troubling signs. James invited a group of friends over to drink beer and play cards, their raucous laughter echoing through the living room. Maria didn't object, she quietly cleaned up the mess James's friends left behind. The two children retreated to Miss Teresa's room to do their homework, avoiding the chaotic scene outside. Dad's invited his friends over again, little Laura sighed, her eyes filled with sadness. Mom will have to clean up all night. Miss Teresa hugged the two children tightly, feeling the hurt they were enduring. When James's friends finally left around midnight, Maria sat down, exhausted, her shoulders heavy with fatigue. Miss Teresa approached and placed a hand on her daughter-in-law's shoulder. Maria, you can't keep living like this. James is taking advantage of you. Maria lowered her head, tears welling up. I don't want to trouble you, Mom. I keep thinking things will get better. But how long have you been enduring this? Miss Teresa asked, her voice filled with sorrow. Since I married James. He's always been this way, but I thought being a wife meant I had to be patient. For the children, Maria's voice trailed off, breaking. Miss Teresa sighed deeply. No, Maria. Patience isn't the solution to keeping a family together. If James doesn't change, you'll pay the price with your health and happiness. Maria didn't respond and quietly left the room, leaving Ms. Teresa with an indescribable ache in her heart. Watching Maria's frail figure retreat, she knew she could no longer remain silent. The next day, when James went out, Ms. Teresa decided to speak with an old family friend, Alejandro, a kind elderly neighbor. He had once helped Maria fix the plumbing when James ignored her complaints. "Alejandro, have you noticed anything unusual about my son's family?" Ms. Teresa asked, her face clouded with worry. Alejandro sighed. "Ms. Teresa, I don't want to meddle in family matters, but I feel sorry for Maria. She works too hard, while James, well, he doesn't do anything. Many times, I've seen her carrying the burden of everything without a word of complaint." Alejandro's words confirmed the fears that had been troubling Ms. Teresa for so long. Her heart felt heavy. "I won't let this continue," she said resolutely. "Maria and my grandchildren deserve a better life." The following morning, Ms. Teresa woke earlier than usual. In the dim light of dawn, she heard soft noises coming from the kitchen. When she went downstairs, she saw Maria diligently washing a large pile of clothes, her hands roughened by the cold water. The sight made Ms. Teresa's heart ache. "Maria, why are you up so early?" "You were up late working last night," Ms. Teresa asked softly. "I'm used to it, Mom. There's so much housework, and if I don't do it, it'll pile up," Maria replied without looking up, her voice weary but trying to sound normal. Ms. Teresa sat down on a nearby chair, her eyes fixed on her daughter-in-law. "You don't have to carry everything alone. Where's James? Why isn't he helping you at all?" Maria paused for a moment, hesitation flickering in her eyes. She quietly replied. "He has his own work, Mom. I don't want to bother him." Ms. Teresa frowned. She knew well that James didn't have a stable job. Day after day, she saw him lounging on the sofa, phone in hand, laughing carelessly while Maria rushed about. The morning passed in a silence so heavy it was suffocating. After preparing breakfast for the children, Maria quickly took Laura and Peter to school. As usual, James remained seated on the sofa, eyes glued to his phone, ignoring everything around him. As soon as Maria stepped out the door, James turned to his mother and said indifferently, "Mom, I need some money. Can you give me some later?" Ms. Teresa froze. "What do you need it for?" James shrugged, not bothering to explain. "It's my business. Just give it to me, I'll pay you back." "Pay me back? How many times have you promised that and never done it?" Her voice grew sharper. James sneered, irritated. "Don't make a big deal out of it, Mom. I'm just asking to borrow it. You have savings, don't you?" Ms. Teresa felt a surge of anger but kept her composure. She looked straight at her son and spoke firmly. "James, I can't keep enabling you. You need to take responsibility for your life instead of relying on Maria." James stood abruptly, his tone harsh. "Don't lecture me, Mom. I know what I'm doing." He turned and stormed out, leaving Ms. Teresa with a heavy heart full of disappointment. That evening, Ms. Teresa decided to observe more closely. She entered her room and sat down, quietly opening a small notebook where she had been jotting down her observations since she arrived. She knew that if she wanted to help Maria and her grandchildren, she needed a clear plan. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from outside. James returned home, reeking of alcohol. He walked straight into the house without a word, throwing his coat carelessly onto a chair. Maria emerged from the kitchen, her eyes filled with worry. "James, have you been drinking?" "You promised you wouldn't anymore," Maria said softly. "What do you know? I work all day, and having a few drinks to relax isn't a crime." James snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "But you don't even have a job, Maria barely finished her sentence when James slammed his hand down on the table, startling everyone. "Shut up. You have no right to talk to me like that." Laura and Peter, sitting in the corner doing their homework, huddled together in fear. Ms. Teresa stepped out of her room, her eyes cold as she looked at her son. "James, do you even realize what you're doing? Is this how you treat your wife and children?" James turned to his mother and scoffed. "Stay out of it, Mom. This is my family, and I'll handle it however I want." "Family?" Ms. Teresa said sharply. "You call this building a family? You contribute nothing, do nothing to maintain happiness, and only destroy and depend on others." James said nothing, glaring at his mother with defiance before storming off to his room, slamming the door behind him. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, as though no one dared to breathe. After James left, Maria sat down, her hands trembling. Ms. Teresa came over, holding Maria's hands gently but with determination. "Maria, you can't keep living like this. You need to do something to protect yourself and the children." Maria shook her head slightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm used to it, Mom. I don't want the kids to grow up without their father." "But they will grow up in fear if you continue to endure this," Ms. Teresa said, looking deeply into Maria's eyes. "You don't just live for your children, you live for yourself too. You need to be stronger." Maria remained silent, but a faint glimmer of resolve appeared in her eyes. Ms. Teresa knew that changing the situation would take time, and most importantly, Maria needed strong support. That night, Ms. Teresa sat on her bed, staring into the dark void. She realized that her silence over the years had partly contributed to James becoming the person he was today. She resolved that she would no longer stand idly by. The following afternoon, while James was out, Ms. Teresa entered his room to investigate. She was shocked to find a disorganized pile of papers on the table, including numerous unpaid bills and debt agreements. She picked up one document and read it. The figure on the paper left her stunned. James had accumulated a significant amount of debt from various sources, with Maria listed as the guarantor for all of it. Ms. Teresa felt as though someone had stabbed her in the heart. She quickly put everything back in place, but her mind was flooded with questions. Why was Maria bearing the burden of such large debts? What had James done with all that money? That afternoon, when Maria returned home with the children, Ms. Teresa called her into the kitchen. She placed one of the debt agreements on the table and looked directly into Maria's eyes. "Tell me the truth about this. What is all this money for?" Maria flinched, her eyes widening. "Mom, where did you find that? Don't worry about how I found it. Just answer me. What has James done that made you the guarantor for these debts?" Maria lowered her head, her voice barely audible. He said it was for investments. He promised there would be profits soon, but things didn't go as he said. I didn't want the kids to go without, so I've been taking on extra work to pay off the debts." "Maria, you can't keep doing this. You're destroying yourself for someone who doesn't deserve it," Ms. Teresa said, her voice trembling with emotion. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, but she shook her head. "I can't leave him, Mom. He's the father of my children. I don't want the family to fall apart." "But this isn't a happy family, Maria. You're trying to hold on to something that no longer has meaning," Ms. Teresa said sternly. "You need to think about your future and the children's. They need a strong mother, not one who is constantly oppressed." Maria stayed silent, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ms. Teresa knew her daughter-in-law needed time to reflect and gather strength. But she also knew that this situation couldn't continue indefinitely. That evening, James came home late, reeking of alcohol. He barged into the house, startling everyone as he flung the door open. Laura and Peter, playing in the living room, immediately ran to Ms. Teresa's room and clung to her, their eyes wide with fear. "Dad's been drinking again," Peter whispered. "Mom's going to be so upset." Miss Teresa held the children close, her heart brimming with anger. She stepped out of the room and saw James arguing with Maria in the kitchen. His voice was loud and full of irritation. What kind of mess is this? I invited friends over, and the house looks like a pigsty. What kind of wife are you? Maria lowered her head, her voice weak. I've been cleaning all day. But the kids made a mess again, and I didn't have time to finish. You're always blaming the kids. You're just lazy and making excuses. James shouted, slamming his hand down on the table. Miss Teresa couldn't take it anymore. She walked straight into the kitchen and stood in front of Maria. James, stop it. You cannot treat your wife like this. James turned to his mother, his face contorted with anger. You don't understand anything. This is between me and my wife. Stay out of it. Between husband and wife. This is how you define a marriage. What kind of husband lets his wife endure everything while he does nothing but enjoy himself? Miss Teresa said firmly. James sneered. Who do you think you are to lecture me? I am the mother who raised you, who gave you everything. And I will not stand by and watch you destroy this family any longer, she shouted, her voice full of rage. The house fell into a heavy silence. James smirked and stormed out of the kitchen without another word. Miss Teresa turned to Maria and saw her trembling, tears streaming down her face. Maria, I will not let you endure this any longer. We cannot let this go on, Miss Teresa said firmly. Maria didn't say anything, only nodded weakly. Miss Teresa knew the time for action was drawing near. The next day, after James left the house, Miss Teresa and Maria began cleaning the living room. While tidying up, Maria picked up a small paper bag. When she opened it, her face turned pale. Inside were receipts from expensive bars, restaurants, and electronics stores. All the transactions were under James's name. The total amount was staggering. Maria, what are these receipts about? Miss Teresa asked, her voice filled with concern. Maria hesitated. They must be James's. Maybe he bought something. Miss Teresa picked up one of the receipts and pointed at the large sum printed on it. Tell me, Maria, where did James get this money? Have you been paying for these? Maria lowered her head, her voice trembling. Yes, a few times he asked me to cover the payments. But don't worry, Mom. I'll figure it out. Maria, you can't keep figuring things out like this. James is not just irresponsible, he is exploiting you. This is not a healthy relationship, Miss Teresa said, her tone becoming more resolute. She couldn't sit by and watch Maria bear the burden of everything. Maria didn't respond, but her shoulders shook. Her eyes revealed a deep helplessness. Miss Teresa could feel that her daughter-in-law was trapped, not just financially but emotionally as well. That evening, when James returned home, he carried a large gift box. He set it on the table with a smug look on his face and turned to Maria. I just bought this. It's high-quality stuff, so don't worry about the money. Maria walked over and opened the box. Inside was a new pair of wireless headphones, something entirely unnecessary for James. Why did you buy this? We need money to pay the electricity bill, remember? James shrugged. What I buy is my business. Don't concern yourself. But this money should have been for the family, for the kids. Maria tried to stay calm, but her voice wavered. The kids? You're always talking about the kids. Do you know how much pressure I'm under? I need to relax, and this is how I do it. If you don't understand, just stop talking. James snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. Miss Teresa stepped out of the kitchen, her gaze fixed on James. James, do you hear yourself? You're making your wife suffer, and now you're blaming her for your irresponsible actions. Mom, I don't need you lecturing me, James scoffed, his tone defiant. You're just a guest in this house, so don't interfere too much. A guest? Miss Teresa repeated, her voice trembling with anger. I'm the one who raised you, who gave you everything you needed to become a man. James ignored her and stormed into his room, slamming the door. The atmosphere in the house felt frozen. Maria sat down, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know what to do anymore. Miss Teresa sat beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Maria, I don't blame you. But you need to stand up for yourself. You can't let James keep walking all over you like this. Maria didn't reply, only lowering her head. But in her eyes, Miss Teresa saw a flicker of internal struggle. She knew Maria needed more time and support to make a decision. The next day, Miss Teresa decided to act on an idea she had been contemplating all night. She called Carmen, an old family friend, and asked for her help. Carmen had been a lawyer before retiring, and she understood situations like Maria's very well. Carmen, I need your advice, Miss Teresa said over the phone. My son James is making life miserable for his wife and children. Maria is afraid to leave because of the kids, but I can't let this continue. Teresa, you did the right thing by calling me, Carmen replied calmly. Maria needs to understand that she has the right to a better life. If necessary, I'll help her plan, both legally and financially. Ms. Teresa felt a wave of relief at Carmen's reassurance. She resolved to talk to Maria again, hoping her daughter-in-law would find the courage to change her life. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Ms. Teresa watched James closely. He lounged lazily, his feet propped up on a chair, while Maria ate hurriedly and stood to clear dishes for the children. Peter accidentally knocked over a glass of water, spilling it on the table. James erupted. Peter, can't you be more careful? You ruin everything you touch, he shouted, making Peter cry in fear. James, that's enough. Ms. Teresa slammed her hand on the table. You cannot yell at the children like that. They are your kids, not your punching bags. James glared at his mother. There you go again, Mom. This is my family. You have no right to say anything. Family? You're destroying your family with your selfishness and irresponsibility, Ms. Teresa shot back, her voice filled with anger. You need to change, or everyone will leave you. Maria kept her head down, silent, but tears streamed down her face. Ms. Teresa looked at her daughter-in-law, her heart aching. She knew the time to act had come. That night, Ms. Teresa sat alone in her room, staring out the window. Images of Maria, her frail shoulders, tired eyes, silent tears played over and over in her mind. She knew that if she didn't take action, Maria and the children would remain trapped in the cycle of suffering that James had created. The next morning, Ms. Teresa began implementing her plan. After breakfast, she sat down with Maria in the kitchen. The two women looked at each other in silence. Ms. Teresa placed her hand on the table, her voice firm yet gentle. Maria, I've thought about this a lot. You can't keep living like this. You need to change your life. Maria lowered her head, remaining silent. After a moment, she softly replied. I don't know what to do, Mom. I'm afraid the kids will be hurt. But your children will be even more hurt if they continue living in this environment. Don't you see? Peter and Laura are always terrified whenever James gets angry. They need a safe and peaceful environment, not the instability they have now, Ms. Teresa said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. Maria began to cry quietly. I know you're right, Mom, but I don't know where to start. Ms. Teresa took Maria's hands. I will help you. I've spoken to a friend of mine, Carmen. She's a lawyer. She's willing to support you if you need her help. You're not alone, Maria. You have me, and I'll be here to support you. Maria looked at her mother-in-law with surprise and gratitude, though fear still lingered in her eyes. Mom, I need more time to think about this. That's fine, I'll give you time. But remember, I'm always here for you, Miss Teresa said, her eyes filled with determination. That afternoon, Miss Teresa once again noticed James sitting in the living room, playing games on his phone, completely oblivious to everything around him. Peter and Laura were playing in the corner, keeping a noticeable distance from their father. Every time James suddenly turned toward them, the children flinched and moved further away. Miss Teresa's heart ached. She walked into the kitchen, where Maria was preparing dinner. "Maria, I need to talk to you." "Yes, Mom." "What is it?" Maria responded, still busy with the dishes. "Do you realize that James isn't just hurting you, but also hurting the children?" Miss Teresa asked, her tone firm. Maria froze, her hands trembling. "Mom, I know, but I don't want the kids to grow up without their father." "But have you ever thought about whether a father like this is really good for your children? Laura and Peter need a good role model, not someone who only brings fear into their lives," Miss Teresa said, her gaze piercing. Maria remained silent. Miss Teresa could see the internal struggle in her daughter-in-law. She didn't want to pressure Maria, but she knew she had to make her see the reality of the situation. That evening, James came home drunk as usual. He stumbled into the living room, knocking over a chair. Laura and Peter, who were playing nearby, huddled together in fear. James didn't notice them and headed straight into the kitchen, where Maria was preparing dinner. "What are you cooking now?" James slurred. I made stew. Would you like some?" Maria asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Stew? Again? Is that all you know how to make?" James shouted, his voice full of annoyance. "Do you know how hard I work all day? Coming home to this is no life." "James, be quiet." Miss Teresa's voice rang out from behind him. She marched into the kitchen, her eyes blazing with anger. "Don't think for a second that I don't know what you do all day. You don't work at all, you live off your wife, and yet you have the audacity to complain." James turned to her, his face flushed with anger. "Stay out of this, Mom. This is my family, and you have no right to interfere." He stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. The house fell into a tense silence. Maria sat down in a chair, burying her face in her hands, crying. Laura and Peter quietly ran to her side and hugged her. Miss Teresa knew that for Maria to make a decision, she needed preparation both mentally and in action. But she also sensed that change was drawing near. Later that night, after James had slammed his door shut and passed out drunk in his room, Miss Teresa sat in the living room with Maria. The children were asleep, and the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock. Maria sat with her head bowed, nervously fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. She looked as though she wanted to say something but didn't dare. "Maria," Miss Teresa began, breaking the heavy silence. "I know you're scared. But fear won't help you or your children escape this situation. They'll be hurt even more if they have to live in fear every day," Miss Teresa said, her eyes filled with conviction. "You've seen how scared Peter and Laura are whenever James yells. They deserve to grow up in a loving family, not this tense atmosphere." The next morning, James left the house early, claiming he had important work to do. After he left, Miss Teresa sat down with Maria at the dining table. She pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table. "Maria, this is Carmen's contact information, the lawyer I told you about. She's ready to help if you need advice or legal support," Miss Teresa said, her voice calm but persuasive. Maria looked at the envelope, her hands trembling. "Mom, I don't know if I can do this." "You can," Miss Teresa said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "You're not just doing this for yourself, but for Peter and Laura. They need a strong mother to protect them." Maria took the envelope, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "I'll think about it, Mom." That afternoon, while cleaning James's room, Maria found a small wooden box hidden under the bed. She opened it, and what she saw left her stunned, a notebook filled with records of debts owed to various people, along with notes revealing that James had used the money for personal indulgences, buying luxury items, and hosting parties with friends. The worst part was that most of the loans were taken out in Maria's name, with forged signatures. Maria held the notebook, her hands shaking. She ran to the living room, where Miss Teresa was sitting and reading the newspaper. "Mom, you need to see this." Miss Teresa looked at the notebook, her face darkening as she read each line. "James forged your signature. He used your name to borrow money." Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom. I'm really scared. If this gets out, I'll have to bear all the legal responsibility." "No, Maria," Miss Teresa said, her voice firm and resolute. "It's James who must take responsibility for what he has done. You need to meet Carmen. She will know how to help you." Maria remained silent for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll do as you say, Mom." That evening, James returned home drunk, as usual. Looking around the house, he shouted, "Maria, come here." Maria turned to Miss Teresa. Her eyes now showed not only fear but also determination. "Mom, I will meet with Carmen. I can't go on like this anymore." Miss Teresa smiled for the first time in many days. She held Maria's hands and said softly, "I know you can do this. You're a strong woman, Maria. You'll protect yourself and your children." In that moment, amidst all the pain and pressure, Miss Teresa felt a flicker of hope. She knew this was only the beginning, but she also knew Maria had found the strength to start a new journey. The next morning, Maria woke up early, her heart heavy with thoughts about the meeting with Carmen. She walked down to the kitchen, where Miss Teresa had prepared a simple but warm breakfast. As Maria sat down at the table, Miss Teresa gently placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice kind but firm. "Today is an important day, Maria. Believe that I'll always be here to support you." Maria nodded, her eyes reflecting both anxiety and determination. She knew this meeting would not only help her seek justice but also be the first step in protecting herself and her children. After dropping Laura and Peter off at school, Maria and Miss Teresa set out to meet Carmen. Carmen's house was in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by lush green trees. When Maria stepped inside, Carmen, a middle-aged woman with sharp but kind eyes, greeted her with a warm smile. "Hello, Maria. I've heard about you from Teresa. Don't worry, everything will be resolved," she said, her voice full of reassurance. Maria sat down, clutching her handbag tightly. She slowly recounted everything from the debts James had forced her to take on, to the irresponsible and emotionally abusive behavior she had endured. As she spoke, Miss Teresa sat beside her, occasionally placing a comforting hand on Maria's arm. When Maria finished, Carmen looked at her with a serious expression. "You don't have to endure this alone, Maria. First, we need to gather all the evidence about the debts and forged signatures James has used. Then, I'll help you clarify the legal responsibilities. But first, there's something you need to know." Maria looked at Carmen, puzzled. "What is it?" Carmen smiled, her eyes twinkling with unexpected gentleness. "Teresa, why don't you tell Maria? I think now is the right time." Miss Teresa nodded slightly and took Maria's hand. "Maria, I've thought a lot since I came to live with you. I've seen how much you've sacrificed and struggled to keep this family together, even though James doesn't deserve it. That's why I decided to do something before things got worse." Maria looked at her mother-in-law, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Miss Teresa pulled a thick envelope from her handbag, filled with neatly organized documents. "These are the ownership papers for my assets. After living with you, I transferred everything into your name, Maria. This is how I want to protect you and the children." Maria was speechless, holding the envelope with trembling hands as she saw her name on the documents. "Mom, when did you do this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "From the moment I realized James wouldn't change and that you couldn't keep enduring this. I prepared this to protect you and the children, Maria. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. This belongs to you, and I know you'll use it wisely," Ms. Teresa said, her voice filled with sincerity. Maria hugged her mother-in-law tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, you've done so much for me. I don't even know how to thank you." "There's no need to thank me, Maria. You've done so much for this family, and I'm only doing what I believe is right," Ms. Teresa said gently but with determination. Carmen observed the moment, smiling with satisfaction. "Maria, with this asset, you not only have the chance to start fresh but also the ability to protect yourself from James. This is where we'll begin." After discussing the next steps with Carmen, Maria felt as though a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. On the way home, she sat beside Ms. Teresa, her heart filled with gratitude and hope. "Mom, I really don't know what I'd do without you," Maria said, holding her mother-in-law's hand. Ms. Teresa smiled, her eyes warm. "You're a strong woman, Maria. I just helped you realize that." That evening, when James returned home, Maria no longer felt the fear she once had. She knew she had the strength and support to face whatever came her way. As James walked into the living room, Maria looked at him with a determined gaze. She didn't say anything, but the confidence in her demeanor made James uneasy. Maria knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. With Ms. Teresa and Carmen's support, she believed she could overcome anything to create a new life where she and her children could truly be happy. In that moment, amidst all the challenges and difficulties, Maria felt a glimmer of a brighter future waiting for her. The next morning, James was still lying in bed, the blanket pulled over his head. The sudden ring of his phone startled him awake. A sly smile crossed his face as he read the message on the screen. It was from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old bar tonight. Don't forget your promise." James quickly deleted the message, tucked his phone into his pocket, and headed downstairs. Ms. Teresa sat in the living room, her stern gaze following her son's sluggish steps. "You're waking up this late. Do you have any plans to do something useful?" she asked, her voice filled with disappointment. James shrugged, replying indifferently. "You act like I don't know how to handle my life. I've got my own plans." He then sat at the dining table, grabbing a few leftover bites of food with his chopsticks. Ms. Teresa said nothing more, quietly observing him. Her eyes lingered on the phone James had carelessly left on the table. His increasingly secretive habits had only deepened her suspicions. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, James kept glancing at the clock, his impatience obvious. "I've got to go out," he said abruptly, standing up as soon as he finished eating. "What kind of business takes you out at this hour? Can't you spend time with your kids instead?" Ms. Teresa asked, her tone sharp. "That's my business, not yours," James replied coldly. Maria quickly interjected, trying to keep the peace. "Wherever you go, don't come home too late. The kids always ask about you before bed." James glanced at Maria, smirking. "Worry about yourself." With that, he walked out the door, leaving Maria looking despondent. Near midnight, James returned home, reeking of alcohol. The living room light was still on, and Ms. Teresa was waiting. When she saw her son walk in, she stood up, her voice icy. "Do you think I don't know what's going on? You're not only irresponsible but also destroying your family." "Here we go again," James scoffed, waving her off. "You're just an outsider. Stop meddling." "An outsider? How dare you speak to me like that?" Ms. Teresa's voice was firm, her eyes blazing with anger. "I've turned a blind eye for too long, but I won't stay silent anymore." James tried to walk to his room, but Ms. Teresa wouldn't let him go. She continued, her tone heavy with disappointment. Do you think I don't know you're having an affair? I saw the messages from that woman. Don't you feel any shame? James froze for a moment, then quickly regained his defiant expression. You're meddling in my life too much. Ms. Teresa stepped closer, her gaze piercing. You're not just a terrible husband, you're a negligent father. You've destroyed the happiness of this family. If you're unwilling to change, you don't deserve to stay here. The next morning, while James was still asleep, Maria unexpectedly found a strange coat in his car trunk. Digging further, she discovered a handwritten letter. James, I hope you talk to your wife soon so we can be together. I don't want to remain the other woman forever. The handwriting was distinctly feminine, and Maria felt as though she had been slapped. Maria immediately brought the letter to Ms. Teresa. As she read it, anger flared in her eyes. He's gone too far. Ms. Teresa exclaimed, her voice shaking with rage. Maria, you don't have to endure this anymore. But Mom, I don't know what to do, Maria said through tears, exhaustion etched across her face. Leave it to me, Ms. Teresa said firmly. Today, I won't let James continue to hurt this family for another second. When James returned home that afternoon, Ms. Teresa was waiting for him in the living room. On the table lay all the evidence Maria and she had gathered, receipts, messages, and the letter. Sit down, Ms. Teresa commanded, her tone brooking no argument. James smirked as he looked at her. What now? Another lecture? No, this time, it's more than words. She pushed the pile of documents toward him. Look at what you've done. You haven't just betrayed Maria, you've destroyed this family. James picked up the papers, his face paling as he recognized the letter. Where did you get this? He shouted, but fear was evident in his voice. You think I don't know what you've been doing behind Maria's back? You've exploited her kindness and patience to commit despicable acts. But it ends here, Miss Teresa said coldly. I don't have to listen to this. This is my house, and you can't kick me out, James said, standing as if to leave. Your house? What have you contributed to this home? Everything here has been provided by Maria. You're nothing but a freeloader, she said, rising to face him. Starting today, you have no place here. James glared at his mother, his face full of rage. You can't do this to me. Oh, can't I? Then look at this. She pointed to the property transfer documents that Maria had signed earlier. This house now belongs to Maria. You have no rights here. James opened his mouth to argue, but the resolute expressions on both Ms. Teresa and Maria's faces left him speechless. After a moment of tense silence, he growled. Fine, I'll leave. But you'll regret this. You won't hurt this family any further, Ms. Teresa said, her voice final. Leave now. James stormed out, grabbing a few personal items. When the door slammed shut behind him, Maria burst into tears, this time tears of relief. Ms. Teresa embraced her daughter-in-law, whispering. From now on, you and the kids will live in peace. For the first time in years, the small home felt lighter. Though the road ahead would be challenging, Maria knew she had reclaimed her peace and strength to rebuild her life. After James's departure, the house became a place of warmth and joy. Ms. Teresa and Maria began reorganizing their lives, cleaning the home and creating a new routine for the children. Laura and Peter seemed to sense the positive changes. They were happier, and their laughter echoed through the house, dissolving the tension that had once loomed over them. Each morning, the family shared breakfast in a cozy atmosphere. Ms. Teresa helped Maria care for the children, guiding them with their homework and telling them meaningful fairy tales. Maria gradually regained her smile, her eyes lighting up whenever she saw Laura and Peter happily playing with their grandmother. In the afternoons, they worked together in the garden, tending to the small flower beds. Peter loved watering the plants, while Laura helped Ms. Teresa pull weeds. When the sun set, they sat on a bench in the yard, chatting about new plans and dreams. In this home, love and understanding replaced sorrow. Without James, they found happiness in each other and began building a future filled with peace and hope. The story of Ms. Teresa and Maria highlights the power of courage and unity in a family. Maria had endured too much in silence, but with Ms. Teresa's decisive support, she found the strength to protect herself and her children. The lesson is clear: no one should tolerate injustice or abuse, even from loved ones. True happiness comes from facing fears and seeking the help needed to change one's life. Love and mutual care are the foundations of a truly happy family.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.